unfortunate thing is that African American women are, when you go on social media, like it's not a positive light how African women are portrayed. When you go in the news, they don't show us these positive examples. That is traumatic in itself. And so it's so important to know that trauma, unresolved trauma, is also a huge part of the cause as well, too, why African American women are heavily affected by that. And then nutrition, diet and nutrition. When you start to look at the diets of not only African American women, but African Americans in general, we by far have the worst diet, bar none. Like when you start to look at what we eat, it is always crunchy, which means fried. It is always salty. It is always sugary and creamy. And it is always processed, the vast majority of it. Nobody is making things from scratch anymore, real ingredients. So when you start to look at that diet that is mostly fried, mostly processed, lots of carbohydrates, lots of meat filled with hormones and antibiotics that affect the hormonal imbalance, the hormone balance in the body, you start to understand why that is literally a prescription for not only reproductive issues, but issues in general. Okay, so that's a huge part of it as well. Another huge part is obesity. 4 out of 5 African American women are either overweight or obese, and fat tissue plays a huge role in dumping estrogen into the body. Okay. And the more estrogen you have in the body, the more tumors grow, whether they be benign tumors or malignant tumors. The more estrogen you have in the body, the more those tumors will grow, okay? And so when you start to think about the obesity rates, 4 out of 5 African-American women are either overweight or obese. Now, that's true for both men and women. But what's really important to understand is how that's going to impact you reproductively and hormonally, okay? Because fat is a living tissue. It is is literally like an endocrine organ producing hormones, and the kind of hormones you don't want it to produce when it's in excess. So that's a huge part of the equation as well. The other huge part of the equation as it pertains to African American women are lower vitamin D levels. Now, again, this affects both men and women, lower vitamin D levels for African Americans, especially African Americans who are of my complexion, who are darker complected. When you're darker complected, it's important to know and understand our melanin is literally like sunblock. Okay, so it's blocking some of the sun. And the reason why is because the first humans on the earth developed in Africa, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is where the sun concentrates, and also you think about the Caribbean, and anywhere across the equator is where people developed and grew and first started. And so when you think about that, we evolved this melanin to reflect sunlight, to repel sunlight as a form of protection. But now we've been relocated from the equator, north of the equator here in America. And so that's why we have lower vitamin D levels, because not only are we at a higher latitude, longitude, but the other thing is that we live a lifestyle where we're not outside a lot. And because we don't have a lifestyle, whereas opposed to our ancestors who not only worked outside, lived outside, like my grandfather would literally, get off work, come outside and sit on the porch all day, just kind of throwing back some water and just kind of being outside in some fresh air. We don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Most of our jobs were outside in the elements, being exposed to the sun, 50, 60 years ago. So we live a lifestyle that is in-house. We literally get dressed, leave out of the house, go straight into our cars covered by the sun, drive through traffic into a parking deck, walk across a covered, walkway into a building. And then we sit in that building for 8 hours and call it work. And then we repeat we reverse engineer the process and go home, never spending any time outside. And some people, we're supposed to be outside. Okay, so lower vitamin D levels have been associated with higher rates of fibroids. And vitamin D isn't just good for bones, it's good for the immune system, but it's also good for regulating things in our body, okay? We have a vitamin D receptor virtually everywhere in our body. So when we're vitamin D deficient, it's not only going to lead to issues around fibroids and reproductive issues and other hormonal issues, because vitamin D is not a vitamin, it is a hormone. So when you are low or deficient in one hormone, you're going to throw off the balance with virtually every hormone in the system. And I think that's the conversation isn't being had in modern medicine, because they don't understand everything as a symphony, as an orchestra. We only understand things in compartments. Okay, so it's so important. You got one imbalance in a hormone, vitamin D, you're going to have an imbalance everywhere in the body. Okay, and not to mention, the more fat you have on your body, fat actually sucks up all of your vitamin D. So even if you're outside enough, if you're overweight, that excess fat is going to suck up all your vitamin D, because vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. Okay. So even if you're getting enough sun and you have excess body fat on you, it will suck up all your vitamin D. You will have a vitamin D deficiency. They quite often don't miss that one. They miss that one as well too. The other thing that I think is really important is, as it relates to fibroids, is that toxicity. Okay, toxicity. When you start to think about the hair care products that a lot of African American women used to use, like the lye relaxers, and how toxic they are to the body and how they affect fibroids. When you start to think about the diet, when you start to think about the makeup, when you start to think about the cosmetic and hygienic products and all of that toxicity. As a matter of fact, I think they said for a woman who wears makeup 4 to 5 days a week, it's like literally putting 10 pounds of chemicals on your body throughout the course of a year. Okay. And the type of makeup that most women are using is unfortunately very damaging to the body. So what I want to do now is I want to drop 8 solutions, because I don't want to just talk about the problem. I want to drop 8 solutions that I think will be really helpful for African American women in our community as it relates to not only fibroids, but in general. So if I ruled the world, this is sort of the beginning stages of a program that I would create for African American women, starting at a child and going throughout life. And of course, I would never create this program without women. But I think these are the things that will be most helpful. The first thing I think will be most helpful is creating an early intervention and education program. And what I mean by that is you can't start this as an adult, because the fibroids start when you're a child. So you can't start this as an adult. This has got to be something that's going to be generational. So it has to start as a child. So this has to be an intervention program where you're intervening on the nutrition, you're intervening on the type of things that are put on the body, like lotions, shampoos, etc. You're intervening and educating on those things, but also exercise, also pregnancy and parenting programs, which is really important, because what I find is most people start understanding pregnancy and parenting when they're pregnant. Okay. So if you have a better understanding of it beforehand, then what's going to happen is you're going to be able to prepare yourself for it throughout life instead of when you get pregnant. So I think that's really important. Sex education, and not from the standpoint of having sex, from the standpoint of understanding this beautiful symphony that women have in their body called estrogen and progesterone, and how luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. I think too few women understand this hormonal symphony that goes on in their body once a month. And because they don't have a full understanding of that, they don't understand how these exogenous estrogens or fake estrogens or synthetic estrogens, how that's impacting it, whether that be birth control or whether that be, phthalates or BPA. So I think having a sex education program to understand your bodies fully, to understand how hormonal balance work is very important too. So that'll be the first thing. Number 2 would be an introduction to self-care and self-love program. I think both men and women need this, but I think this is would be also really important